whispers have begun to ripple through the corridors of global diplomacy. At first, they were nothing more than vague hints, an unusual phrase here, a cryptic statement there, buried deep in Moscow's official briefings. Then came subtle nods from Russian state media, quickly dismissed by skeptics as routine posturing. But now, the world's most respected geopolitical outlets are reporting the same thing. Russia has issued a direct warning to the United States. Until recently, such claims might have been written off as fear-mongering or sensational headlines. But when senior Kremlin officials speak in unison, and when the message is amplified through both diplomatic channels and televised broadcasts, it becomes something else entirely. A signal too deliberate to ignore. This is not the language of quiet negotiations. It is the vocabulary of confrontation. The warning itself, while measured in tone, carries the weight of a red line. Analysts describe it as the most serious verbal escalation between Moscow and Washington in over a decade. And behind the formal phrasing lies a stark message. The era of patience is over. And the next American move may trigger consequences the world has not seen since the height of the Cold War. To understand the weight of this warning, one must look at the long and turbulent history between Russia and the United States. These are not just two countries with differing interests, they are the twin architects and rivals of the modern world order. From the frozen standoffs of the Cold War to the uneasy handshake after the Soviet collapse, their relationship has been defined by mistrust, competition, and occasional flashes of cooperation. In recent years, that fragile balance has eroded. NATO's steady expansion eastward, Washington's sanctions targeting Russian industries, and Moscow's growing military footprint from the Arctic to the Middle East have all pushed the two powers into a new cycle of suspicion. Each diplomatic summit ends with more questions than answers. What makes this moment so different is not simply the sharpness of Russia's words, but the backdrop against which they were delivered. The world is no longer unipolar. New economic blocs like BRICS are challenging the dollar's dominance. Regional powers are testing the limits of American influence. And now, in this shifting landscape, a direct Russian warning to Washington is not just a bilateral dispute. It is a potential fracture line in the global system itself. The spark came suddenly, without the courtesy of back-channel warnings or gradual escalation. In late July, Washington announced a new package of sanctions targeting Russia's energy exports. Not just oil and gas, but also the lucrative nuclear fuel sector that Moscow supplies to multiple countries. The move was framed as a response to continued destabilizing actions. Yet its scope went far beyond previous restrictions. For the first time, secondary sanctions threatened any nation that continued large-scale energy purchases from Russia, including several of Moscow's closest trade partners. The Kremlin saw it not as economic policy, but as a direct strike at the heart of its geopolitical leverage. Within hours, state media declared the measures an act of economic warfare. Behind closed doors, senior officials met with military and intelligence chiefs in an emergency session that lasted well into the night. But it wasn't only the sanctions themselves. American warships had recently carried out freedom of navigation drills in the Black Sea, a move Moscow interpreted as a message written in steel and gunpowder. The combination of financial chokeholds and military maneuvers convinced Russian leadership that the United States was no longer just containing them. It was closing in. The response from Moscow was swift, calculated, and unmistakably deliberate. Within 24 hours of Washington's announcement, the Russian Foreign Ministry held a rare late-night press conference. Standing before a wall of national flags, the spokesperson's words were measured, but their meaning was razor-sharp. Any further hostile steps will be met with consequences that the United States is not prepared to face. No elaboration followed, just a silence that seemed heavier than any threat. Simultaneously, the Russian military raised its readiness level in several key regions. Satellite imagery revealed long-range missile units being repositioned toward western borders, while strategic bombers conducted unscheduled patrols over the Arctic. The message was clear. Moscow was not only talking, it was preparing. Behind the scenes, diplomatic cables were sent to major world capitals, warning that Russia would consider certain U.S. actions as crossing a point of no return. Allies in Asia and the Middle East were quietly reassured of Moscow's resolve, while neutral nations were urged to maintain distance from Washington's policies. It was more than a reaction. It was a line drawn in the shifting sands of global power, and for the first time in years, the United States had to consider that Russia might actually mean it. The world's response was immediate and divided. In European capitals, foreign ministers convened emergency meetings, torn between reaffirming solidarity with Washington and avoiding direct entanglement in a potential escalation. NATO's Secretary General issued a carefully worded statement calling for dialogue and de-escalation, yet orders quietly went out to reinforce Allied positions in Eastern Europe. In Beijing, the reaction was notably different. State media praised Moscow's firm stand against unilateral pressure, while high-level trade delegations accelerated talks on energy cooperation. In the Middle East, several governments refrained from public comment but began discreetly exploring new security assurances with Russia. Financial markets reflected the tension. Oil prices surged, the ruble stabilized after an initial dip, and defense stocks in both the U.S. and Russia spiked sharply. The warning from Moscow was no longer just a diplomatic story. It was reshaping alliances, strategies, and the calculations of every major power. Analysts now warn that the standoff could evolve into multiple dangerous paths. One scenario sees Washington doubling down, expanding sanctions, mobilizing more naval forces, and pressuring allies to isolate Moscow entirely. Such a move, however, risks triggering Russia's own countermeasures, restricting critical energy supplies to Europe, halting rare earth exports, or deepening military cooperation with China and Iran. Another possibility is a regional flashpoint spiraling out of control. The Black Sea, the Baltic, or even the Arctic could become the stage for a military miscalculation, where a single incident ignites a broader conflict neither side initially intended. Then there is the economic front, a tit-for-tat war of currencies and trade routes that could fracture global markets. In every scenario, the danger lies not only in deliberate action, but in the speed at which mistrust is eroding the last safety valves between the two nuclear powers. As the world watches, the crisis hangs in a precarious balance. Each side tests the other's resolve, yet neither is willing to be seen as backing down. In Washington, security briefings grow more urgent, while in Moscow, the language of deterrence hardens into something less reversible. Diplomats privately admit that the margin for error has nearly vanished. A misread signal, an intercepted aircraft, or an unannounced military drill could trigger a chain of events impossible to contain, and in the background, a shifting global order quietly accelerates. New alliances form, trade flows adjust, and old certainties erode. The Russian warning to America is more than a momentary flare-up. It is a marker in history's turning tide. Whether this becomes a brief confrontation or the opening chapter of a deeper conflict will depend on decisions made in the coming days. Decisions the world cannot afford to get wrong.